Hey everyone, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. In today's video, we're going to be talking about intrusive thoughts and how to manage them in a healthy way. Intrusive thoughts are unwelcome or involuntary thoughts that are overly negative or disturbing in nature. They usually take the form of negative self-talk. Oftentimes they take the form of images, so imagining yourself doing something or something happening to you. And they typically seem foreign or very disturbing, like not something you would normally do or not something you would even normally think about. And then they tend to result in a lot of really uncomfortable, painful emotion, things like shame, anxiety, regret, sadness, anger, things like that. So there are all sorts of intrusive thoughts, right? And a really common form of intrusive thought that we all experience is something like worry. You're walking down the aisle in the supermarket and the thought pops into your head, what if I get fired from my job tomorrow? You didn't choose to have that thought. It just popped in your head. It was negative. But the thing about that is it's not, while it's negative and it's surprising maybe, it's not totally out of the ordinary or, while it's upsetting, it's not necessarily disturbing. Now, an example of a truly intrusive thought might be something like you're laying down in bed, getting ready to go to sleep, and suddenly the thought pops into your head of being romantically or sexually involved with someone other than your spouse. You didn't choose to have that thought. You don't like the fact that you're having that thought. In fact, you're kind of horrified by it and disgusted by it, but there it is. That's an intrusive thought. Or another really common example is I used to work with a lot of folks who struggle with anxiety, and I worked with a lot of new moms who struggle with postpartum anxiety. And a common symptom of postpartum anxiety is negative intrusive thoughts about harming your baby or your infant child. Now, as you can imagine, this is very disturbing, extremely disturbing to be a new mom, to have this new, beautiful little young baby, and to imagine yourself have thoughts pop into your head about doing something harmful to the baby. Now, it turns out this is actually fairly normal and not uncommon. It's also not predictive of anything bad. Like people who have negative intrusive thoughts about hurting somebody, including their own baby, for instance, are not any more likely to do anything than people who don't have those sorts of thoughts. So they're not assigned necessarily that something's wrong. They're pretty common, and while very uncomfortable and painful and disturbing, they're not indicative of something wrong or broken or dysfunctional within you. So that's really important to understand. That said, how you respond to negative intrusive thoughts is really critical. And in fact, the way a lot of people tend to, by instinct, respond to them, which is either to avoid them, try and distract themselves from them, or try to analyze them and fix them and get rid of them. Both of those responses tend to make intrusive thoughts worse. Because when your brain sees you either running away from something or attacking it and trying to get rid of it, it assumes that thing is dangerous and a threat. So it's going to make you even more on the lookout for and sensitive to those things in the future. The result is you tend to have even more frequent negative intrusive thoughts the more you either try to avoid them or get rid of them. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to show you how to, in a very healthy and effective way, deal with those negative intrusive thoughts. I'm going to go through 3 key ideas, and at the end, I'm going to walk you through a very specific and concrete exercise that you can do to manage these negative intrusive thoughts better. Number 1, don't assume your intrusive thoughts mean something. Like children and new puppies, intrusive thoughts love your attention. The trouble is, the more attention you give to negative intrusive thoughts, the more frequent and intense they become. Of course, when you experience an intrusive thought, especially the first time you experience a really foreign, disturbing, negative intrusive thought, it's very normal to think, oh my God, what's wrong with me? How can I be having a thought like this? This is so disturbing. This is so messed up. And then you start to think a lot about what it means. Notice you're assuming that it's significant, that it means something. So you start thinking things like, where did this come from? Why am I thinking like this? Why am I having thoughts like this? What does this mean about me and my personality and my mental state that I'm having thoughts like this, horrible thoughts like this? Am I going crazy? Maybe I'm literally going crazy because I'm having thoughts like this that are so crazy seeming. So all that's very understandable. But the thing you have to know and understand is intrusive thoughts don't necessarily mean anything. Unwanted intrusive thoughts are very common. Research suggests that at least 90% of the population experiences these unwanted intrusive thoughts at least once over the course of their life. And common themes for these unwanted intrusive thoughts are typically around violence and aggression, contamination, or sexually inappropriate behavior. These are by far the most common forms of intrusive thoughts. But as I alluded to earlier, when the more you start thinking about your intrusive thoughts with the assumption that they must mean something, the more you analyze them, the more you elaborate on them, the more you question them and wonder about them and explore them, the more you reinforce them. Because essentially, when you're putting a bunch of attention on something, your brain thinks it's really important. And so if you're constantly thinking about and keeping your focus on these unwanted intrusive thoughts, your brain, understandably, is going to think, hey, these things are really important. Maybe I'll throw more of them at them. Or when they cross your mind, you're going to be more sensitive to them and you're going to get hit by them more frequently. So you really want to check this assumption or belief that just because you have an intrusive thought, it must mean something really important. Almost always, they don't. Number 2, don't get into arguments with your intrusive thoughts. Many people who experience negative intrusive thoughts get into the habit of analyzing and trying to disprove them. And while this strategy superficially seems like it might be helpful, it's actually totally counterproductive because you arguing with your thoughts is not going to convince them to show up less frequently. But you arguing with them is giving them attention. And when, again, like we talked about, when your brain sees you giving something a whole lot of attention, it thinks it's important. So rather than trying to argue with or try to disprove or otherwise kind of dismantle those intrusive thoughts, so instead of trying to argue with or disprove your unwanted intrusive thoughts, a better way to handle them is to validate them. And to validate them, it's actually very brief, very simple. It just involves 3 little things. You're just going to acknowledge and label your intrusive thoughts. Oh, there's an intrusive thought. Next, you're going to normalize them. You're just going to remind yourself, hey, I don't like this, but it's actually normal to have these. The vast majority of people have them sometimes. And then lastly, you're going to remind yourself that they are valid or understandable. So you might say something to yourself like, well, actually, I know that my mind throws weird things at me all the time. I mean, when I dream, you have all sorts of weird, strange thoughts. That's your mind throwing intrusive thoughts at you. So the fact that they happen sometimes during the day, it's actually not that surprising or strange. Okay, so instead of getting in an argument with your intrusive thoughts, work on validating them instead. Number 3, do not try to distract yourself from your intrusive thoughts. In 1987, there was a psychologist named Daniel Wignall. Actually, I think he's still alive, not was. Anyway, this psychologist, Daniel Wignall, he did this very famous experiment, one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. It's called the White Bear study. And what this study showed was that by instructing participants to deliberately try not to think about a particular thing, in this case, a white bear. So he told people, whatever you do not think about a white bear. When you do that, there is what's called a rebound effect. And people actually end up thinking a lot more about white bears than if you had just, exposed them to a picture of a white bear or told them a story about a white bear, but not told them to deliberately not think about them. So trying hard not to think about a thought actually leads you to think more about the thought. This is called the ironic process of thought suppression. When you deliberately try to suppress a thought, more often than not, it leads to you having that thought or similar thoughts much more frequently. It's as if you're saying to your brain, oh no, I can't have this thought, or I need to stop thinking about this and distract myself with something else. It's like you're telling your brain again, this thing's super important. Even distracting yourself tends to be counterproductive because through this ironic process, it just leads to more and more of the thoughts and all the disturbing emotion that comes with them. And this process is really important to know about because when people end up really struggling with unwanted intrusive thoughts, like when it happens constantly throughout the day and it's causing tremendous amounts of anxiety and emotional suffering, almost always the reason for that is because they've inadvertently reinforced those thoughts and made them more common precisely because they're trying to distract themselves. Anytime the thought pops up, they're going, no, I can't think about this. They're always like pulling something out, distract themselves, whatever. And that just makes it more and more common. Trying to get rid of or distract yourself from unwanted intrusive thoughts will only make them stronger and more frequent in the long run. So like we talked about in the last point, it's important to briefly acknowledge and validate them before you shift your attention onto something else, whatever it is that's meaningful or important or that you need to be doing in that moment. Okay? Doesn't mean you have to dwell on your unwanted intrusive thoughts, but you do need to briefly acknowledge them and validate them before redirecting your attention somewhere else. So when those unwanted intrusive thoughts pop into your head, label them. There's an unwanted thought. It's okay. It's normal. I know research shows that lots of people have these. There's nothing wrong with me because I'm experiencing these. And what am I now going to shift my attention onto? What thing do I need to be doing? What do I want to be doing besides thinking about all these horrible thoughts that are running through my mind? Now, that you're probably thinking, like, well, that sounds nice for you, Nick, just sitting there saying that, but it's really hard in the moment. I feel like when these intrusive thoughts pop in, my brain just gets pulled to them like they have gravity or something. I can't help but think more about them. It's really hard. Yes, it is. But partly, to a large extent, it's hard because you haven't practiced doing anything else. If you've struggled with intrusive thoughts, what you've been doing over and over and over again is going with them or immediately running away from them. And this new process of briefly acknowledging and validating them and then refocusing on something else, that's a new skill. And like any new skill, it's going to be hard and it's going to be uncomfortable and a little frustrating until you practice and get better at it. And one of the best ways to practice and get better at that skill is through what I call mindfulness training. Now, you've probably heard about mindfulness in the past. It's become very popular recently. Mindfulness meditation, right? Mindfulness for stress reduction, for relaxation. There's all sorts of things people use mindfulness for. Spiritual enlightenment, going to sleep faster, all sorts of stuff. When I talk about mindfulness training, this is a way to use mindfulness for the purposes of controlling your attention, getting better at deciding, I want my attention to go here and not here. An intrusive thought popped into my brain. I actually want to focus on the report I need to be writing for work, or the movie I'm watching with my wife after dinner, or the conversation I'm in with my kid, or whatever it is. That's a mental muscle. And mindfulness training is a way to practice and strengthen that mental muscle. And it's actually very simple. It can be challenging, like any exercise, but it's really simple. At its core, all it involves is you sit still, you close your eyes, and you focus on your breath, on the sensation of breathing. Not thinking about your breath, not breathing deeply, anything like that. You're just noticing what it feels like to breathe. Now, inevitably, you will get distracted. Intrusive thoughts, maybe not really morbid or strange intrusive thoughts, maybe some of those, but maybe just, stuff from your to-do list or stuff on your grocery list or some conversation you had 3 days ago. Stuff will pop into your mind. When that happens, you want to gently acknowledge that as a distracting thought and then refocus your attention back on your breath. That's it. A lot of people get frustrated and end up giving up on mindfulness because they think, oh, this is not relaxing at all. It's really hard. Well, yes, it's an exercise. It's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, you wouldn't be working anything out. So that's very normal. You don't want to get down on yourself or criticize yourself for not doing it right just because it's hard. It's supposed to be hard. And then the other thing is, you also want to be really careful of being critical of yourself for getting too distracted. The whole point of the exercise is to get distracted, to notice that you're distracted, and to return your attention back to your breath. So just because you got distracted 400 times in the span of 5 minutes, that doesn't mean it wasn't a good session. In fact, that could be a very productive session because you had 400 opportunities to practice noticing that you were distracted and returning your attention back to your breath. Now, if you think about it, this is the exact skill you need to deal with unwanted intrusive thoughts. A thought pops into your head. You need to A, notice that your attention has gone to this thought and hopefully start to notice it pretty quickly. And then B, return your attention back to whatever it is you want or need to be focusing on instead of keeping it stuck on the unwanted intrusive thought. Okay, so mindfulness practice is a really helpful exercise to develop this mental muscle of attentional control, which will help you be aware of and acknowledge and validate a difficult, unwanted thought, but then move off from it in a helpful and productive, healthy way. If you want to learn more about it, I've included a link in the description below that I wrote an article, kind of a guide to how to get started with mindfulness training. So you can check that out if you're interested in it. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more from me about anxiety, intrusive thoughts, emotional health generally, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind. It goes out every Monday morning, and you can sign up for free using the link in the description below.